Her sister is totally and completely deaf, and she was just sitting there watching it all. She watched me speaking, she couldn't hear anything. She watched me play the cello, she couldn't hear anything. She then, in the middle of the piece, she saw it was a bit odd. I put the bow down and picked up another one. I played with the broken bow, which she didn't know that that's what it was, and she heard it.
Welcome everybody, this is Simon Gilbo with Inspired, and I'm very excited to have an old friend who I've never met in the flesh, which is interesting, isn't it? Because we've a lot of different connections, but we've missed each other. I was due to preach in Jersey during lockdown, but that was Kibosh. That's where you're based, isn't it, Gerard? Everybody, welcome to Gerard Feuvre.
Yeah, thank you so much.
So Gerard is he's a cellist and he's a director of the King's Chamber Orchestra. Yes, I'm really excited to get into that, but we'll hold off a bit. Listen, for those of you that are new to Inspired, basically there's so much rubbish and depressing stories around, and we just aim to stir faith, to point people to Jesus, and to look at mates from all sorts of different spheres and walks of life as they live out their journey and see God's kingdom breaking in. And I know, Gerard, you've got loads of stories, so I'm really excited about it. I don't know much about your background. Well, what was your first link with me? How did we first get in touch, going back?
I came across your book, Choose Life, and I read it avidly, and I thought it was absolutely fantastic. So much so that I bought maybe 50 copies and started giving them out to musicians. So I'm basically a missionary in the music profession, and my orchestra is a Christian community first and foremost, although we are a professional chamber orchestra. So there's a lot of discipling involved in our movement and mentoring, and your book is one of my principal weapons. I'm giving it out to all my musicians, particularly young musicians, that come my way as part of a discipleship thing, really, and we all get a lot from it. One of my best friends who's a young preacher, boom, he's in there getting so much from your book. So I felt like I knew you through that, and in a way we probably share that in common, that when you share your life publicly like I do in concerts, a lot of people feel they know you, and they come up to you and they seem to know a lot of details of your life, but you don't know them. But we've actually gone a bit further than that, haven't we, Simon? Because we've corresponded quite a lot, and I started writing to you when you were traveling, and it's been great, and I do consider you a really good friend.
Brilliant. Oh, that's great to hear. So let's go right back. I don't know your sort of history pre-Jesus. How old were you when you came to faith?
Oh, yeah. So that's all part of my strange story. So I grew up on Jersey. My mum brought us up, and, I was kind of, life wasn't easy for me, really. I remember just feeling really misunderstood and really lonely. And, my parents had split up, and somewhere in the midst of all of that, I found the cello. And the cello was a kind of salvation of it in itself, really, because I just loved it so much. I threw myself at it. And then my kind of life's adventures all came through the cello when I ended up living abroad and studying and going places and so on. And I absolutely wasn't a Christian, and my family weren't either. And I used to rage against Christians. So I was strong and I was up against the world and everyone, really. But my goodness, did it change. And that's all part of my story, that, I went to the Royal Academy of Music. I got a scholarship. I won scholarships all kinds of places and countries and so on. And the last period of study I did was in Finland, and studied with one of the greatest cellists in history. Mm-hmm. And while I was there, one day, out of the blue, I went for a walk in the forest. I walked a long way until I sort of went past any white noise, no roads, no aeroplanes, and there was silence. And this was very interesting, because when my parents were splitting up, I used to stay with my grandma. Now, my grandmother is a legend in my heart, really. She was the Christian in the family. She was one person who was a Christian. She prayed for me every day of her life. But when we stayed with her when we were kids, when I was about, 9, 10, 11, 12 years old, I would sneak downstairs in the middle of the night when she was fast asleep upstairs, and I would flick on the TV and I would watch horror films. And they would be considered very tame now, because they were old black and white films, Dracula and all the rest of it, but they were not tame. They were terrifying. And I had nightmares for years. I was really fascinated, and I would do that. Now, that's relevant because all these years later, when I was, say, 21, and I was in a forest in Scandinavia, as I was walking, suddenly it went totally silent, utterly silent. The birds stopped singing, the wind stopped blowing, everything stopped still, even the trees stopped moving. And I was terrified because it reminded me of a horror film where everything would stop and go silent, and then the people would be attacked by a bear.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought, I'm about to be attacked by a bear. And I was absolutely terrified. And in my terror, I did something that I wasn't used to doing, because in my pain as a young person, I was very much about myself and trying to sort of beef myself up. But at this moment, when I was terrified, I started listening. And it occurred to me as I was just standing there listening that surely the birds wouldn't stop singing if there was a bear. Surely, the wind wouldn't stop, the trees wouldn't stop moving. And then this sort of awe came over me. I was absolutely awestruck. And I started listening, and I heard the audible voice of God.
Wow.
And he said, "And now you will worship me." And I just fell on my knees. And I was totally not a Christian before that moment. Didn't believe in God, squashed people that did. And I heard the voice of God, and I fell on my knees and I wept for hours. And it was like a warm river coming through my body. It was like the whole of the world went into Technicolor from black and white. It was everything. And actually, sometime later, I was reading the Bible, really sometime, maybe a year later, I found a verse in the Psalms that said, "One thing, God, you have spoken, but two things have I heard, that you are strong and you are loving." And it's kind of like a riddle, because it doesn't say what God said. One thing, God, you have said, but it doesn't say what it is. But it says, two things have I heard, that you're strong and loving. And I remembered when I read that scripture that when I heard God's voice, it was overwhelming how loving he was and overwhelming how strong he was. It was an absolute eternal, the sound of eternity. And sometimes people have, I've watched people trying to persuade someone that God loves them. And I kind of, he absolutely does, God loves us. But the balance that I received by hearing his voice personally, that incredible eternal strength and love, is incredible. It's just with me forever, every day of my life.
Yeah, so I'm trying to think. I have lots of friends who would say the Lord spoke to them in a very clear way, and I would have that a number of times in my life, very distinct, but not audible. I think you might be, if not the first one of the very few that's so, any more on that?
Yes, well, the thing is, I'm a sound person. I'm a musician. So I think in music, my family get frustrated with me because we're having conversations and suddenly I zone out. I really try not to, but my head's full of music. And I do think in terms of sound, so I'm going to react very much to the vibe of sound. And I remember going on my cello journey, becoming a Christian changed everything. But I longed to make a sound that reflected God, like God loves you, he's strong, he's going to take care of you, he's got a plan for your life. To invest all of that in a sound and have a vibe, like the love of a parent, father or mother, and I couldn't do it. And I practiced until I was blue in the face. For a period of my life, I practiced 10 hours a day, and I could play very fast and very impressively. But I went and played a big solo piece in Sweden with a conductor who's a friend of mine. And he didn't quite express it to me at the time, but he was disappointed. How do I know that? Because many years later, I went back to play the same piece with the same guy, and he couldn't believe it. And he said, I can't believe how much you've changed. When you played the first time, you were like a human machine gun. You could play loud, you could play fast, you could attack us with your playing. Now, when you play, you kiss us, you hug us, you love us,
Beautiful.
You make us cry. How is it even possible that a person could change like that? And I said, well, I've learned to worship God. And it's just changed my heart. And there was a given moment when I was in a project with a load of Christian musicians, and we were each given a scripture. And mine was about how the hearts of the fathers shall turn to their children, and the hearts of the children shall turn to their father. And as I played and thought about that, I started sobbing, and something was healed in me. And the sound that I'd always dreamed of making on my cello, that would in some small, puny human way reflect God suddenly arrived in my life. And I wept, and I am just so grateful that God would visit just someone like me, help me to play the way I want to. And it's a form of communication, so you're giving out a vibe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just beautiful. I feel like we jumped quite a long way. Going back, why were you so anti-Christian as a spotty youth?
Yeah, I was definitely spotty, by the way. And I also was like experimenting with trying to find who I was. And I dyed my hair when I was at music college. I dyed it blue, and it went really kind of permanently blue. So then I added a green and a gold, silver streaks and all that kind of stuff. And I was very grungy. And I was anti-God because I had the sort of people, the churchgoers that I'd met, were very judgmental and very loud, and they would certainly tell you within a nanosecond of meeting them what was wrong with your life and what you needed to do. Whereas I was a lost child, lonely and sad and feeling rejected, and I needed some love. And when I heard God's voice all those years later, first of all, my grandmother had prayed for me for 20 years every day.
Yeah.
And then his presence arrived. How persistent was my grandmother? Incredible. And it's actually particularly moving because she would have been a professional musician, but she had to give up her possible career to bring up her 4 children because she lost her husband in the war. So she then invested her whole life's musical energy into me, helping and supporting me. And her prayers came to fruition on that one day. But I had, up until that point, I just found the whole concept of Christianity, it was all about judgment and being judged, and I didn't like the people that I met. And that's led me to a point today where, and I think you and I have this in common, Simon, that we see that the world, we could be frustrated that the world sees the church through one lens. The church is judgmental, it's loud, it's prepared to tell you where you've gone wrong. But actually, what the world needs is loving. And so often I've managed to really help people by ignoring the rubbish that they come out with, full of anger and full of tension, and just cutting to the chase, which is loving them and giving them a bit of TLC and helping them out a bit. And then you realize after a period of time, they start to open up and listen and think, and it's a different route. But I find the older generation generally want the route of sharing the information. You need saving, here's the information, I'm going to save you now. But the younger generation and the sort of our generation are much more, they react to a vibe. And so with our music in my orchestra, we bring a vibe first and foremost, and the information comes later.
Right, yeah, fascinating. So you had that incredible audible voice of God experience. What was the next step?
It was brilliant, actually. I went on a course in Sweden, and we had to do auditions to play in a masterclass with this incredibly famous cellist who was my teacher. And various people auditioned, even from America, from other Scandinavian countries. And they either passed or not. If they didn't pass, they could be a spectator. If they passed, they could take part in it. One American girl failed, and she just cried so deeply and was very upset. And then this guy walked on. He was Swedish, and he was borderline. And our teacher spoke to me in French, actually, saying, "Well, shall I let him in or not?" And I was saying, "Oh yeah, go on, let him in." But he didn't. So he failed. But this guy didn't react. He didn't cry. So I looked at him and I thought, "What's the matter with you? Are you an idiot? This is so important, and you didn't get in, and you're not reacting." And that was interesting. And that night, I heard him playing jazz piano in a cafe. It was the first time I ever met anyone who was basically a classical musician who also played jazz really well. So I was really interested in him. So we became friends. And then he offered me a lift to the airport at the end of the week. And then on the way, he said, "Well, look, you're going on standby. Why don't you come and meet my family on the way?" So I did. It was several hours drive, but I went and met his family, Swedish family in the north of Sweden. And then they said, "Oh, come on, have a meal with us." And then they said, "Well, why don't you catch the plane tomorrow on standby and you can stay overnight?" And the long and short of it was that I stayed with them for 3 weeks, Simon.
Wow.
And they were an awesome Christian family. And they said to me, so you're going to laugh about this, and it is ridiculous, but they said, was I Christian? And I said, yes, I am. I've met Jesus in a forest and I'm a Christian. And then they said, well, what do you think about the Bible? And I said, well, I don't really think it's important. I just don't, it doesn't really feature. And then they did the wisest thing. And I hope some people listening to this will really ponder this one. They did the wisest thing. They perceived my need and they just loved me. They ignored what I was saying and they just loved me. They loved me relentlessly and monotonously every day for 3 weeks. And by the end of that time, I wanted to be like them. And they read the Bible every day. So I then fell in love with God's word. And I read the Bible through 3 times in a row. And that was the beginning of the full experience, to know about God and to know him personally. But I always applaud them to think that they just perceived my need and loved me. That is good.
It is good. So presumably you came back to England, did you? I mean, what can I ask without bragging, what sort of level you reached where you won the best in the world?
I had won scholarships to many different places. I won a scholarship in Canada, in America, in France, in Switzerland, Finland, Sweden on courses. I'd won a scholarship to the Royal Academy, where I actually took first study cello and piano, which is very rare, although I stopped concentrating on the piano because the cello became my great love. So I had arrived at what many people would regard as a real sort of top level. But as a new Christian, when I came back to London at the end of it all, I was a bit complicated about whether I was allowed to be a performer, because it seemed to me that, in essence, performers are often about themselves. So your life could be me, 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 but the Christian life is about him, 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 him. In fact, a New Age person in an orchestra said that to me. They said, what would it do for me if I became a Christian? And he was very much a New Ager. And I said, well, your life is all about me, 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 and our life is all about him, him, him. And I was a bit brutal with him, actually. I said, also, your playing is as cold as a fish and your only hope is to come to Jesus and he will put a fire in you.
Love it. How did he respond to that?
Well, he didn't respond well at all at the time, but actually all these years later, I haven't seen him, but I just got an inkling that maybe things are working out for him on that front. So that's really fun, isn't it? But so I actually took a job in a church, like as a music director, to give myself a bit of space to think, what am I doing with my life? And I did that for several years, and I became like a missionary person. I formed like drama groups and vibrant sort of youth choirs and stuff like that. And we went on missions to different countries and shared our testimony and all this kind of thing. But over a period of a few years, 5 to 7 years, I thought, no, the call of my life is to play the cello. And so I left that job and I set up. And within a short period of time, I was playing principal cello in London orchestras like the English Chamber Orchestra on a freelance basis. I joined a very famous string quartet. And certainly I played with some of the great players in the world. And I did masses of solo work. I traveled to America and ran Europe playing as a soloist. But I also was exploring where I should put my energy. And at some point, I'd started experimenting with gathering Christian musicians. I think 1985 was the first time, actually. And what I pulled together there became the King's Chamber Orchestra, a professional chamber orchestra of a community of believers. And gradually it became my whole life. So I gave up all the kind of solo for myself working, and I perform still a great deal, but with the King's Chamber Orchestra, and it's everything I do, really.
I love it. Guys, if you wanted to see Gerard in action with his gang, you could just put on YouTube King's Chamber Orchestra, and it's under 3 minutes that explains what you do, and it's like you sort of see the energy, the vibe. You prance and dance around the stage. There's humor and creativity and improvisation. It's just wonderful. Is one question that's an interesting question: is God a musician?
Well, I think his voice is like music. Like I experienced, the sound of it was just like, for me, like a symphony. And I think actually the church isn't always good at dealing with artistic people who think artistically. And I've been reflecting this week on Van Gogh, because Van Gogh, but by many is regarded as the greatest painter in history. But he was an amazing Christian when he was a young man, and he was so passionate and fiery and full of colour. He was rejected by his church, which was very sober and very much sort of thou shalt not do this and that and the other. And so he was thrown out. He was a fiery preacher, and he had to turn to his second love, which was painting. And he had a Bible he carried with him in his life, and he was a sinner. He was messed up. He was messed up by that rejection most of all, but he perceived how colourful God was, and in the colours of the universe, he saw God. And it's very moving when you study this and you read his writings. I think in terms of music. So I see God as a musician, but I see him as the greatest artist of all. He flung the stars and created the universe. And the more you stop and listen and see that, the deeper your relationship can be with God. I mean, I don't refuse to sing many songs, but there is one hymn that I don't like to sing. I'm going to slightly disguise it because I don't want to prejudice anyone really, but there is this hymn, and it sort of says, the mountains are beautiful, but they're not as beautiful as Jesus. The sunsets are lovely, but they're not as beautiful as Jesus. I really hate that song, because what I want to say is said more accurately by Phil Wickham in the song Beautiful, where he sort of says, in the mountains we see the grandeur of the Father. We see Jesus in the sunset. We see him in creation. We see the marks of his fingers. We see his mind parading forth in Technicolor the wonders of the universe. And the more we stop and appreciate it, the more we buy into respect for the planet, the more we see God, in my view.
And you also, I mean, humour is a massive part of your life and performance and interactions, isn't it? Tell us about, laughter.
Well, when I was playing with the London orchestras, I was very worried about whether I'd make friends and everything like that. And actually, one or two people out there really very cruelly found out I was a Christian and then publicly mocked me as an opening line. So I walk into an orchestra, maybe I was on trial, playing principal cello, all ears and eyes were on me, and someone would sort of just mock me, and that would be the opening thing. It didn't happen all the time, but here and there it did. So I used to get on my knees and pray, God, help me bring something funny. And it's a strange prayer. It'd be hard to find that in the Bible, but I actually think all I can say is God answered my prayers. So I go into an orchestra one day, and something like this happened, and there was a funny atmosphere. And then the conductor, he turned round, and I was playing the first cello and leading the cellos. He turned round and he said something that no one understood. He was like, if you're not a computer person and someone says to you, oh, you just need to download a zip file, unzip it and run the program and virus check everything or whatever, and you don't know what that is, you're hearing gobbledygook. It was a bit like that in musical terms. And he says, I want you to play a considerable agogic accent at the melodic summit of the phrase, or some musical stuff that nobody understands what it was. I didn't understand what it was. So there was silence, and the whole orchestra looked at me, and he had told me I had to convey this to the cellos. So I looked at him in the eye and I said, interesting. And then the entire orchestra collapsed in hysterics. and the rehearsal stopped for 5 minutes while they wept with laughter. And this was something to do with something that happened the previous week when I wasn't there that I didn't know about. But God gave me the one word that would unleash this hilarity, and I became like their favourite person. So it was just so beautiful to bring humour. And I thought, when we laugh, it's very healing, isn't it? There's something in the body that it brings healing and opens us up, and we start listening better. And the whole thing is a brilliant exercise. So we've just developed a great sense of humor. I mean, I got that from my dad. My dad was so hilarious. It was ridiculous. And it's actually affected my life hugely, the humor thing. I studied in America with a man called Aldo Parisot, the most famous American cello teacher in the 20th century. And he, in a masterclass, I did something a bit weird. I played a few notes that didn't kind of quite work, and he stopped and he screamed at me. He was very intimidating, and he really shouted at me, and the room stopped and gulps and all the rest of it. And I looked him in the eye and I said, you shouldn't complain. In other words, I gave as good as I could get. And he stopped and looked at me and I said, it's like when you're talking and you're slightly out of control in your vocal cords and you accidentally go boom in the middle of the sentence. And then he just cried with laughter. He cried with laughter. So then he said to me, Gerard, you've got to introduce this concert with your beautiful English accent. So we had a big concert and we played a piece by a famous South American composer, Villa-Lobos. And I looked it up in a book because this was pre-internet. And it really, it was for me anyway. And it said that this piece had been written for him. So I said, well, I'm going to introduce this. You better tell me about it. And he just said, no, very emphatically. He said, you English, you're all actors. You're all brilliant. You improvise. You make something up like this. And the pressure was on me hugely. It was a piece called Modinia. And I didn't know what that was or anything. So I walk out and there's this orchestra. And then he's walked on to conduct, and I stand up to introduce it. It's a massive audience, and I made up a load of rubbish. And I said, well, Modinia is a very, very sad song of the Fisher folk on a coastal village in Brazil, and they are pining because of the sudden and unexpected migration away of all the fish. And this was just a complete fantasy. So he stood there and started shaking. And then tears started running down his face. And he couldn't conduct. And the concert couldn't continue. And he had to leave the stage where he just cried with laughter. And about sort of 5-10 minutes later, he composed himself, came on, and we did it. And because of that, every single time I saw him, he burst out laughing. And it was a brilliant, brilliant thing. So he invited me and was prepared to give me a scholarship to study in Yale in America. So I was due to go and visit him and stay with him and his wife, Elizabeth. And he was quite elderly and he'd gone to hospital, had an operation. And the very day I arrived, was being picked up from hospital by his wife. They came to the train station to pick me up and he was in agony, having had this hernia operation. So Elizabeth, she leaps out of the car and heads me off at the pass and says, Gerard, when you get into the car, don't make Aldo laugh like this, because that would have been painful, sort of thing. So we opened the door in the back of the car. It's quite a big car, just a crack. And I saw his eyes and he saw my eyes. He looked at me and he howled with laughter. And then he howled with pain. So I wasn't even able to go and stay with him. I had to go and stay with a student. That's hilarious. I mean, that's been my life. It's just been brilliant, brilliant fun making people laugh. I made everyone laugh. So it's a gift, and I'm grateful for it.
I mean, living in a war zone for many of those years in Burundi, sometimes, I mean, we just cry with laughing, and it was so releasing. And all the more you need humour and laughter in darkness, don't you?
You do. In fact, Simon, it's so good of you to say that, because this very weekend I've made a new friend who's going to be, I'm absolutely sure, a friend for life. And he's a cellist in Ukraine, in Kiev. He's called Vlad, and he is in a war zone, and he goes off with members of his church delivering aid, helping people, maybe helping people escape one part of the country, all that sort of stuff. But he's a cellist. He's a young man in his late 20s. And we just became friends, and he will come one day, God willing, and play with my orchestra. But I did write to him and just say, you're in a war zone, and I don't know if it's inappropriate that I make you laugh. He was so grateful for the laughter. He just said, we need to laugh.
Yeah.
That's so good to hear you say that. And I feel we don't want to respond to these horrific things in the world kind of in shallow terms or glibly or anything like that. We want to be deep, but it's just great to be human.
Yeah.
And
God, gave us the gift of humor, the gift of laughter. We could have not had that. What a massively different life would lead without humor.
Well, don't you think that humor is common to humanity, like eating? And sometimes in the church, we're so kind of anxious to share what we have and what we know about, that we create a them and us. but we have so much in common with the world. We laugh and cry, we die, we're born, we eat food. I really love my starting place to be music, food, laughter. Before we know it, we're friends. And if we're friends, you want to know about my life and I want to know about yours.
That's right. Yeah.
Mm.
Hey folks, I hope you're enjoying the podcast. I'm loving the response we're getting from across the world. It's just wonderful to see how encouraging and inspiring it is being and hitting the spot. Listen, if you are being blessed by it, I'd love it. Basically, this happens under the auspices of our ministry, Great Lakes Outreach, which works in the poorest and the hungriest country in the world, which is Burundi. We're having an incredible impact in the toughest of circumstances. We want to carry on supporting those local folks doing a great job. So if you wanted to, greatlakesoutreach.org/inspired. You could make a donation there. I'd so appreciate it. Also, it's word of mouth, isn't it? So gossip these podcasts to other people, get them to subscribe, give us a great review. Absolutely wonderful. So grateful to you. So that's greatlakesoutreach.org/inspired. If you want to do a monthly, a couple of quid a month, or a one-off donation, we'd be incredibly grateful. All right, now let's get back to the podcast. Now, what music is your raspberry and white chocolate pudding?
That's a that's a question. So I have to admit, you probably thought, that's a very random question, Simon, but I did prime him with that question. I really like the combo of raspberry and white chocolate. And I feel like I'm definitely a foodie, and unfortunately I've got a bit of a sweet tooth. But and by the way, I'm going to just tell your listeners now my top tip. There's a top tip. What you do is you go out and you buy some white chocolate buttons, and if you can get the super large ones that some supermarkets have, that's particularly good. Then you make yourself a really hot cup of tea in whatever way you want it. Then you put a large white chocolate button on your tongue, and then you close your mouth. And then you take a sip of hot tea. I mean, not so hot that it's going to burn you, but really quite hot. And then you just remain still for a moment, and the white chocolate melts in your mouth. And it is just incredible. It's absolutely incredible. There is a teeny weeny part of that experience that is a bit like hearing God's voice in a forest. It is an absolute revelation. And only God can produce a world that can bless us quite that much. So I'm just passing that on to you, Simon. But my raspberry and white chocolate is that kind of music that bursts upon you with great feeling. And sometimes it's classical music, but it could be jazz. I've got a son who's a jazz musician. He infects us with his love of his music. I've got a daughter who just loves all kinds of pop music, Korean pop music. She has infected us with her love of it. Some Japanese film music she's brought to us, which we love so much, we cry when we hear it now. But the fact is, I react to food and I react to music. So the question about the kind of, the raspberry and white chocolate thing, it's some things really, really get to me, and I can't really pin it down. I happen to like Mahler Symphony No. 2, which was it's called the Resurrection Symphony. Some people call it the greatest symphony ever written. And Mahler went to a funeral and he was singing a hymn, and in the middle of that hymn he was poleaxed by God. He was absolutely poleaxed. Did he have a perfect life after that? No. And that's the point, we sometimes look at historic figures with judgment and think, unless their life was perfect, they actually weren't actually really Christians. But hang on a minute, only Jesus was perfect. So Mahler had this revelation and conceived a symphony about the resurrection. He then wrote it. It was very different from anything that had ever been written, and it was not entirely rejected, but it wasn't really received that well. But by the time he was approaching the end of his life, it was starting to be regarded as one of the greatest pieces of music ever written. And it's absolutely spine-tingling if anybody wants to listen to it. It's very long, but at the very end, when the choir sing, and it's like the gates of heaven open and they sing about the resurrection, it's absolutely astonishing. That is one of my raspberry and white chocolate pieces, really. Duke Ellington's sacred pieces, sung by Alice Babs, a Swedish singer, went around the world with him, so it's jazz. Amazing. Also, sometimes music speaks, and I think people get on this bender where they want to make sure that everything that they listen to is written by a Christian who also brushed his teeth that day, or her teeth, with a Christian toothbrush, after breakfast, having eaten a Christian apple, and the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. We definitely want to avoid some kind of stuff, don't we? I stood outside a pub in Denmark recently, and the pub was called Debauchery, and I thought, no, I'm not going in there. I've got a great photo, which, by the way, I'll send you, of me standing next to the sign. But anyway, but the point is, the earth is the Lord's, and God can speak through anything.
Yeah.
There's a group, Simon, called The Killers.
Mm-hmm.
And they've done a song, and there's a line in it: "Are we human? Are we dancers?" Sometimes it's on when you're on a waiting line for booking a flight or something, and they put you on hold, and they put that music on, and I'm sobbing by the time they actually answer. And I'm so touched by that song, but it's not to do with the life of the guy behind it, who's not particularly a Christian. I think he's from another religion, but he's found a little bit of something there that really touches me from God.
Yeah. Listen, I know you're an open book, and you're willing to be vulnerable. I'm sure it hasn't been all plain sailing. Can you share some of God in the midst of dark times in your life?
Yes. I could make many choices there, but a very tough thing was that when I became a Christian, my mum was very upset about it. And she had it took me a long time to understand this, but she had the same experience, that Christians are judgmental and you don't want to be like them, kind of thing. And she didn't want me to talk about it. She more or less forbade me to talk about it. But I prayed for her and loved her. And then there came a really, really difficult moment. And it was at the time that I founded the King's Chamber Orchestra, when we had our first big London concert. And my mum was rushed into intensive care and prepared to die. And her heart had collapsed, her lungs had collapsed. She'd had a reaction to a experimental medical drug for something, and she was going to die. And when I got to the hospital, she was in a coma, and all I could do was pray. But at least she wasn't forbidding me from praying or talking about it, because she was in a coma. And I went there and I prayed for her for a couple of days. And then I had to leave because we had that event, that big concert. And I felt God enable me to go, and that I could leave her bedside. And when I did that concert, we had half of the concert was music, and this, as in classical music, and the second half was worship. And during the worship, a random guy called Josh, who's like a hippie walking past the building, heard this music, which for us it was worship, sort of improvised worship, kind of, I suppose you'd say charismatic worship if you want, but and he was fascinated, and he came in. And there was a glass wall at the back of the church, and he was pinned up against the wall by something he couldn't see, strangely enough. So his arms were out, and he looked as if he was on the cross. Wow. And he wasn't able to move at all until he'd surrendered his life to Jesus. That happened in our first concert. And then I was expecting my mum to be dead. And the next morning they rang and said, "Get here as soon as you can." I go legging it up to the hospital, which was in the Wirral, and went to intensive care where I'd left her, and she was gone. She was not there, and I realized she died, and I was distraught. But then the nurse came and took me by the hand and took me into a normal ward where my mum was sitting up talking to the neighbours.
No way.
Yeah, and they had told me when I went there at the first that she wasn't responding to anything, and they save her, and she'd slip away within hours. And so I asked all the neighbours to go so I could have a moment with Mum. And I was really emotional, and I said, I didn't want to upset her in case she had a relapse. It just shows how faithful I was. I don't want you to have a relapse, I don't want to upset you, but surely this was a miracle. And my mum, she certainly cried, but she stopped me and she said, well, I never knew you were there because I was in a coma, but they told me afterwards. But where I was in that coma, it's hard to sort of describe it. But at first I thought I was alone. And then suddenly I realized someone was standing by me. And I tried to turn and see who they were. And I realized it was Jesus. Oh. And he took me by the hand and I gave myself to him.
Oh,
so my mum was then a Christian for the rest of her life. And she then died of cancer after the happiest 7.5 years of her life. She took me to church, to her local Anglican church, and she did not lose in her Christianity one bit of her super colourful character. There was a vicar who happened to be bald, a youngish vicar, and after the service, I'd never met him, and she was new. She rushed me up to the front to meet the vicar. She said, "You're going to meet the vicar," and she'd never met him. She said, "My name's Carol," and introduced my son. "And I want to tell you something." And he said, "Oh yeah." She said, "Did you know that God only made a few perfect heads? The others he covered in hair."
Brilliant.
This was my mum's opening night, so you can see also where I get my sense of humour from.
Yeah.
That was very, very moving. I don't know if you've got time, but I've got a second dark moment. Have we got time?
Yeah.
So about 10 years ago, or slightly more maybe, I was suddenly diagnosed with incredibly terrible cancer. And on a Gleason scale of aggressiveness from 0 to 10, 10 being the most aggressive, it was proved to be 9.7, I think it was. And the doctor consultant was trying to impress upon me that it was just absolutely desperately serious. Later on, I found out that they felt that I probably had 3 months to live. And the consultant wrote to my GP to say he didn't feel I'd taken it in or I was taking it seriously. But in actual fact, my reaction was rather muted, because in my mind, when they gave me this news, I simply extended my right hand out and put it in the hand of God. Sorry, I get emotional thinking about it. Yeah. But from that moment, God was by my side. But the deepest thing that has ever happened in my life then happened, because I went through terrible treatment for 5 years, mostly radiotherapy and hormone therapy. And I didn't die, and people died around me. Sometimes they died after a short period of radiotherapy, and I had so much more than they had. But of course, we can't compare one to each other. But I continued to live, and I shared my faith as I went along with people and so on. But when I was well enough, I was living in a hospital in Southampton, I would go and visit a church. And I went to one church, and at the beginning of the service, they said, "Come up the front and get prayed for all through the service. Don't wait till the end." And in the worship, I went up, and this guy prayed for me, and I felt heat enter my body when he prayed for me. Mm-hmm. Now, during that period, I was receiving so much treatment, I kept falling over. And my left hand, kept landing on my left wrist, and it became very bruised, and I possibly not broke the bone, but sort of fractured it. And it became too painful to play the cello, and that was really sad. I had my cello with me and I couldn't play anymore. It was just too painful. So in that service, I got prayed for by this guy, and he turned out to be a GP, and heat entered my body, and something went clickety-click in my left hand, and suddenly I was free and pain-free, and I could play the cello again immediately. And that was very exciting. And he called the team over, and they prayed for me some more, and he said, "God is clearly here and at work. Now, do you want us to pray for you until you are totally healed, even if it takes me all night and all tomorrow?" And I answered in a way that I'm baffled about this, because it doesn't seem logical, but I said no. I didn't say, "No, don't do that." I said, "I have the strongest feeling that God is doing what he wants, and I'm to walk forward from this moment now." And what I saw was, as I went through the treatment, the grueling treatment, instead of having the quick fix healing, which we don't even know if it would have happened. Of course, God can do that, and he does sometimes. And sadly, he doesn't always, or we don't see it always, and we long for those breakthroughs. But the fact is that it was going through the grueling years that changed my character and helped me to become much more the person I need to be and who I could be. So it was the beginning, for example, and this is my biggest confession, it was the beginning of me learning to listen to my children and my wife. Because I think my gifting and my kind of loud and funny character meant I was very much the center of attention in my life. And that illness was the beginning of me allowing them to inhabit the spaces and for me to calm down and listen. And I became a vastly better dad. I mean, maybe I'm not a good dad, I don't know. But whatever type of dad I am, I'm so much better than I was.
Yeah.
I think we had hilarious and brilliant times as a family when they were kids. But it's been very much deeper healing going for the slow road with God than it was the instant quick fix.
Fascinating.
Yeah, really fascinating.
Oh, mate, listen, we've got hours more I want to talk to you, but I think we've probably got about 10 minutes max. So the King's Chamber Orchestra. Now, I'm sure you've got a load of highlights. Can you give us a few, just where you've seen the Lord do beautiful stuff?
Well, we do events with churches, and they invite their whole neighbourhood in, and they invite us year after year for, we've been doing it for over 30 years, because they know everyone's going to be welcomed and it's very user-friendly. But we do this thing where we can go out and play and improvise and bring a personal gift to the audience. And they're so often touched and weeping at this point. And then we can share some testimony. But we don't do it till we feel that the atmosphere is right. And it's just my dream. Somebody in the orchestra said, the King's Chamber Orchestra is the orchestra that restores our childhood dreams. And working together is the greatest thing. I mean, when we couldn't play together in the pandemic, we met, even if it's in 2s and 3s or sometimes a larger group, we met online every single weekday and prayed together through the whole pandemic. So we did our last concert, then the pandemic came down, then we prayed together 500 times, then we did our next concert. And the power in that is evident because there's a unity, a love present in the group that is like nothing I've ever known in any working environment. And there's power in it. And I could illustrate it in that when my mum did eventually die, I got a little bit of money and I could buy myself a nice cello bow. I have a very lovely cello. That's another story for another podcast. But I could get a bow. And so my mum's money bought me a lovely bow, French bow made in the 1930s, really, really special. And I played with that for years and years and years. And then I went somewhere new to a famous repairer to get the bow rehaired. The bows, they have horsehair on them that you tighten and so on, but you need to get them rehaired every year. And incidentally, Simon, you can get 24 bows worth of hair from a horse's tail, but only if you first detach it from the horse. I'm just making that point. Wow. So I went to get the bow rehaired, and the guy in the shop said, these bows are quite rare, but we've got 3 in the shop. And I was amazed. So I said, well, show me. Now, one of those bows was perfect like mine, and it felt the same. And another one had been snapped in half. And he had then, because he's a world-famous repairer, put a little metal tiny pin, drilled holes in it and strengthened a little rod. And then he'd glued it with some special graphite compound. He'd computer color matched it, so you couldn't even see that it had ever been broken, but it is a broken bow. And I thought to myself, how is that going to play? It's lost its value. It's lost, how it was made. A broken bow, can it do the job? So I picked it up and I played some notes. And my cello, so I'm going to cry again, my cello went into orbit. I mean, it went to the moon. My cello sang through every single millimetre of it like I'd never heard it sing. Wow. And it was the greatest bow I'd ever held in my life, and not even that valuable. So I wouldn't even put it back down on the counter. I wouldn't let go of it. So I got a credit card out of my pocket and bought it. And as I left the shop, I realised that I'd be able to sell my perfect bow to help with our kids' secondary education and the bills of that moment and so on. And so, that was good. But before I sold it, I played in concerts, and I played a little piece, and I played on the perfect bow, and halfway through in each concert, I switched to the broken bow to show the audience, and I told them. And when I switched to the broken bow, there were always people in the audience who absolutely gasped because suddenly the air was full of something. They couldn't understand what it was. It's just a sound, their sound shall go up, let the Prince of Glory fill the air. There's something about just the sound of it. So that was very exciting. And in one concert, there was a middle-aged lady sitting with her sister. Her sister is totally and completely deaf. And she was just sitting there watching it all. She watched me speaking. She couldn't hear anything. She watched me pick up my bow and play the cello. She couldn't hear anything. She then, in the middle of the piece, she saw it was a bit odd. I put the bow down and pick up another one. I played with the broken bow, which she didn't know that that's what it was. And she heard it.
Oh.
So I'm not aware of to what extent that, she was healed. She was a visitor, but she heard something for the first time in years. And afterwards, I prayed for her that God would do more. And, that is an incredible story, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's an incredible story. So I decided that we, Simon, you and me, we are that broken bow, because in our dark moments, in our brokenness, we learn to sing. We learn to sing God's praises like nothing on earth, When we're arrogant and kind of just life is good and our ideals are that we should be a middle-class Christian in a nice house and our kids go to a good school and have things and we live for what we can achieve and have, it's also shallow. And the difficulties in life, they cause us to rise up, or they can cause us, if we let God do it, to rise up and sing and worship him.
Yeah.
And if I can say to your listeners, if you want to hear us, go on Spotify. You'll find a few things on YouTube. We've got so much material we haven't uploaded, but we are starting to. But there's a couple of albums on Spotify, and there'll be more soon. And you can hear our improvised worship in a series called String Heaven. And we're all of us in the group, broken in different ways, singing our hearts out, filled with joy, and laughing ourselves silly as we travel.
Absolutely fabulous. All right, 2 more questions. Let's pack it in. What are you most famous for?
Oh, this is embarrassing, but it's also fun. You'll see this on YouTube. I'm most famous for making spontaneously an instrument out of a carrot and performing a piece with it. So you have to look up King's Chamber Orchestra Carrot Concerto and you can watch it. We liked it so much, there's 2 versions out there on YouTube. And I am, everywhere I go, people want it. But you can't always buy decent carrots. Like, they have to be big, they have to be very hard and not rubbery and soft. You can't always get the quality of carrot you need, So, but occasionally I do perform that. So there you go.
Don't make them like they used to, eh? All right, last one, and this is a meaty one, I'm sure. What's your single hardest and the best decision of your life?
I'm tempted to say it was that decision not to be prayed for until I was totally healed. So I've told that story, but I think I've actually thought, as you asked that question, I thought of something else, and it was the single hardest decision of my life was to allow myself to be loved. And the first human that I allowed in to do that was my future wife. And she's had a hard time with me because I was, as a rejected kid, and you're not instantly healed of everything when you become a Christian either. I just didn't want to be loved. And I felt like a powerful love of a human, like, I must say, the love of a woman is a very, very powerful thing for a man to experience. And it's almost as if you feel probed in your inner places, like they seem to get right in there and understand you and love you and all the rest of it. And I think there's an instinct in men that want to hide themselves. Perhaps we sometimes feel ashamed of who we've been or are, and to be prepared to be loved. So my wife has literally taught me, a lot. I still have some way to go, I think, sometimes, but obviously experiencing God's love in his voice and was the big thing opening me. But these have been hard decisions to allow yourself to be vulnerable and to walk forward. So I'm grateful for my wife and a few friends along the road who've really helped me find the healing I needed. And it's not just that I've got a sob story and all my parents got divorced. I love my parents and they were amazing and we had a great time and we thank God for them. And I had wonderful sort of healed relationships with them both. And they're not with us now, but that it's great. But we've all, even if we come from a perfectly whole household, life throws stuff at you. Sooner or later, you're going to find something that's going to kick you and hurt. but how we react to it will determine the path of healing for us under God, really.
Amen.
Mm.
Right. I feel very moved. I feel challenged. I feel stirred. I feel encouraged, inspired. Exactly what we want out of these podcasts. Gerard, I'm really grateful for your time, buddy. If people want to book you, want to be in touch, how can we best?
Find our website. I'll just tell you that it's obviously www. But then it's KCO, Kingstone Orchestra, kco.cool. It's a great website, isn't it? kco.cool, COOL. It should be really easy, but you can look us up, Kingstone Orchestra. You'll find us. Send us there's a contact form there. Sign up to our newsletter. Is just getting people interested in our concerts and so on. We don't smack people with elements of our faith before we know them. So we just draw people into our concerts. But people that come will find out who we are and who we serve.
Great. All right, buddy. Bless you loads, and keep up the wonderful work. It's been a real treat. Listen, everybody. I presume you've been inspired and moved and challenged and all the above. If you have been, please share this with other people. Basically, it means the algorithm, if you give us a review as well, top quality review on iTunes or Spotify, it means that more people get to hear it, more people get stirred and lifted out of their doom and gloom, the doom loop that is so common right now in our culture and society. So give us a great review. Be in touch with me if you want to on simongilbo.com or any of the other social media platforms. Next week, we'll have another fantastic guest. Looking forward to that. In the meantime, God bless you and toodaloo.